and perhaps not what made you guys so interesting as an ensemble, is that you didn't really quite know, because I don't think anyone ever on the set of a television show, unless they're an astonishing wanker, sits around and says to everyone else, "Oh, we're changing the world here, we're changing television." No one says that.
Hi, and welcome to this very special season of McLaren Versus, celebrating 25 years of the iconic series The Secret Life of Us, a show that is somewhat close to my own heart. Now, over the next few episodes, we're going to be talking to some of the cast and the creators of the show to give you that access all areas chat you have come to expect. So sit back as we take you on a ride through the noughties and one of Australia's most loved TV series from the inside out. This is McLaren versus The Secret Life of Us. Well, I'm very excited to be sitting in my house, and you're in your house, but sitting opposite, if you like, in the digital world, Michael Idato, who is the cultural editor-at-large for Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, and has been a television critic and consultant as well, having worked on things like Wentworth, etc., and the author of thousands and thousands of articles around television and its cultural significance and place, not only in Australia, but globally. And he is based out of LA normally. He is a good old Aussie, as you'll hear in a minute if you haven't heard him speak. And we've captured him back here in Australia just pre-Christmas for this bit of a chat. Michael, thank you so much for joining me.
It's a pleasure.
We're obviously here to talk about the Secret Life of Us, which is its 25 years, which I can't believe in itself. It's 25 years. 2026 marks the 25th year since it was aired first on Channel 10. And I wanted to have a chat with you because of everything I've just said there in your intro as well. Like you have been a cultural commentator and contributor for such a long time in this space. And we were just talking off air originally about how Secret Life was a game changer. I wonder if maybe we start there about sort of talking about when Secret Life of Us happened. What do you recall about the landscape of Aussie TV at that time, and what did it open the doors to and change for us moving forward?
So, Australian television is, because of its scale relative to the rest of the world, I think lots of people see Australian television as not a cottage industry, but it is it's a small, very energetic industry that makes a lot of choices based on limitations of cost and potential production scale. So we, for example, historically, we've never made things like Game of Thrones. We don't, we just don't make, and I think also there's an Australian appetite for realism that meant that we don't even really make genre shows so much. Our staples historically were lawyer shows, hospital shows, cop shows, and the driving engines were suburban soap operas, whether that's the inland suburbs in Neighbours or the beach suburbs in Home and Away. So there's this we have this kind of little bubble of tropes that we've kind of always played with. It also kind of comes from the infancy of Australian television. They were shows like Certain Women and Bellbird that were sort of laid this. There's an ordinary Australia kind of theme that runs through it. So when Secret Life of Us comes along, this is a landscape that's been informed by Country Practice, by Blue Heelers, a show like, sort of staple soap operas like Neighbours and Home and Away, but with very few deviations. So a show like Prisoner, for example, which is set in a women's prison, essentially fits the cop show template, but was probably at the time, certainly in the late 70s and early 80s, the most ambitious kind of sideways step we'd ever taken. When The Secret Life of Us lands, there is a sort of one thing, we talked about this offline, but one thing that was fascinating me about television is there's a kind of TV speak, which is to say stuff that's said in TV dialogue is not really real human conversation. You kind of listen to things, there's sometimes a joke in, comedy writing where, you'll see an exchange and someone will respond by going, "I didn't know people spoke like this." And the joke being that people on TV really don't speak like real people. They don't have conversations like we have. They say things in dialogue that work for television but would seem ridiculous if you said them in real life. None of us turn up at each other's doors to confront each other in kind of that soap operatic way. what makes John Edwards as a producer and the writing rooms that he built so compelling, I think. And this is that generational step. So every now and again, along comes a show that says this is how we're really going to try to do things now. Is that John Edwards created these writers' rooms that really embraced very realistic dialogue. But the striking thing, I think, to everybody with Secret Life of Us was just that it felt very fresh. It felt very young at a time when TV was probably full of, let's not be ageist, but it was not, if you had a show cast as young as the Secret Life of Us cast, you were making Neighbours or you were making Home and Away. You were not making anything that sort of had a greater
time drama.
Yeah, correct. So there is a real freshness to this show that lands dialogue that I think the strange thing is that we thought we'd never heard before, but it took a moment to realize you were all only talking in the way that people talk. Like suddenly there was this quite realistic dialogue, which I think that's I think the compelling anchor, because the eye and the ear as a viewer, they go immediately to things they don't know, that are not familiar, because they're exciting and they're interesting and they are new flavors and they are new sounds. And I think maybe the great clever sell of The Secret Life of Us is there was nothing in it that was perhaps genuinely extraordinary, in the sense that it's a fairly straight show, it's a good cast of actors, and the dialogue is kind of just very realistic dialogue. These are not like hugely ambitious ideas, but the execution is extraordinary, because nothing on TV was like that. And all of a sudden I was like, oh wow, there's this amazing group of actors doing these really interesting things, and they're talking in a really...
The team were able to put that together, which was great. One of the other things that I particularly look back on and am really proud of, I guess, is the representation that show had, whether it be between Deb Mailman as Kelly and Indigenous actors on screen, or whether it be queer content, etc. I seem to recall at the time, because obviously number 96, you mentioned that before, number 96 had some queer representation, which was way ahead of its time. I think we were the first primetime male kiss on television, sort of thing, if I recall, which was great. But how do you think that landed within? Do you think it upset anybody at the time, or do you think that was part of the reason it was so refreshing, because it kind of went those places?
I think so. Number 96 is itself a study, a much more complicated, strange study. And I don't think it was an aberration. I think it was a natural evolution, because I think the thing that's interesting about number 96 is it represented the most dramatic pendulum swing into that sort of bold, crazy, very adventurous, very strong, shocking storytelling. But the pendulum swings around, and I think that we kind of swung back into conservatism, and I think that swing gives rise to what we see with The Secret Life of Us, which is again a kind of push into the ability to tell something a little bolder than the mainstream. There's probably a couple of things going on. One of them certainly is the involvement of Channel 4, which is not to say that I don't think John Edwards would have won the fight to do these things without Channel 4, but I think it helps having a partner in Channel 4 who clearly themselves have these expectations, who in those discussions would be saying to him, as he would be saying to them, this is the objective. And, for someone like Channel 10, and remembering Channel 10 did air number 96, so it was not that I think the DNA endured or is in any way influential here. It is just an interesting footnote to note that it was 10, which was historically a younger, edgier, less risk-averse network than 7 or 9, which were more centrally positioned, mainstream, family-focused kind of networks. But I think having a partner like Channel 4, gives someone like John Edwards the leverage to go into a negotiation saying, these are our partners, they're footing part of this bill, so we all have to be mindful of everyone's needs. They want this as much as we want this. So, there is this kind of, there's a push for that. I think the actual, I don't recall The Secret Life of Us being met with outrage. I'm certain there would have been conservative commentators at the time who probably found issue with some of the stuff around Richie's sexuality. But I think the key thing again, which is this sort of, I think, which is a big part of that that John Edwards drama culture is that when this show lands, maybe it's true that, it took dynamic forces like Channel 4 or John's own track record, or how he negotiated with 10 to put Kelly and Richie and people like characters like that into the show. I think what's interesting though is that they do represent mainstream Australia. And I think what lands with this show, as much as I talk about realistic dialogue, I think again the most powerful pieces of television resonate because, and this isn't just television. Art is a mirror. Now, it's either a reflection of us, a reflection of our context, a reflection of things we're experiencing. Now, that can be a reverse reflection. It can be we can be experiencing one thing and yearn for the opposite, or we can look into the mirror of television and want to see ourselves looking back at us, all the people around us. And the truth is that if you walk through any city in Australia, you see Asian Australians, Indigenous Australians, gay Australians, tall, short, green, blue. Like there is a sort of, and one of the great criticisms of mainstream Australian television, perhaps less so now, but certainly I think the criticism still endures because the issue still remains, which is, it's a real struggle to get kind of a diverse reflection of who we really are. And there are arguments around all of that. But there's also kind of a baseline case where I just think, well, you know what, if you switch on this show, you just don't see anything other than this. And there is just so much more going on out there. So I think part of the appeal again is, and part of that reminder to the audience, or the introduction to the audience, that there's something fresh and interesting and true, and I think true is the key word going on here, is that when you do switch on this show, you kind of see Deborah playing Kelly and you go, I've sort of met a girl like her. Like, I know she's a real person. She's not a television imaginary construct. I've kind of met someone. But you've also met, Alex, Claudia Carvin's character. You kind of go, oh, I've kind of met her too. And I've met Miranda, and I've met Will, and I've met Richie, and I've met Gabrielle. And you kind of go, these people they're not strange to me. There's something appealingly, they're in my street. These are the kids that live in that apartment block across the way. Oh, that couple. They're like the couple who live over that. So there's that, which I think part of the power of the way it lands is that it talks to this kind of more lived truth that we live. And I think, the thing is, it's still a question. And I think it's a question as relevant in 2025 as it was, when The Secret Life of Us landed, as it was indeed in the 1970s, when no doubt, Bill Harmon, the producer of Number 96, had fights with Channel 10 about the things that they were doing in their show. I think great TV producers have always understood the power of the platform. They've also deeply understood the limitations of it. Yeah. So I think in the mind of someone like John Edwards, he's as aware of what he can do as he is aware of what market forces will try to stop him doing. And I think he understands that his job, the key to that job, in addition to great stories and great characters and all these things we pat ourselves on the back for, the heart of his job is to bash those boundaries as hard as he can, to get so close to them that he doesn't get himself in trouble and he doesn't ruin the show, but somehow he pushes everybody into this inch of space that we have not previously inhabited, or we feel we haven't previously inhabited. And in that little space is freshness. That's where that originality and inventiveness and the spark of whatever that intangible magic spark lives.
I remember as well at the time that, you talk about that normality, these people down the street. I've seen them, I know them, that kind of thing. Big Brother landed during, I'm going to say like maybe between season 1 and 2, I seem to recall there as well, which is, the death of television. Reality is here. Do you think it's an accident that we kind of were drawn to the sorts of shows that, Secret Life came into being, which there was this recognition, authenticity and normality to these people. And then the next evolution is we're literally watching real people in a box,
We are, of course. And I think the thing with reality television is, as much as it's contrived, because it is contrived, reality television shows, there are some reality television shows, many, that employ writers' rooms as well. They have as many writer, producers, and experts in story working for them as dramas and comedies do, because those touch points and those edits and all of, it's reality is not always reality. But again, I think it lives somehow in a strange sort of truth. And I think certainly the first Big Brother, to look at the context in which The Secret Life of Us landed, the first Big Brother was actually, I think, very powerfully true, because I think even the people in it didn't really understand the format. They were very innocent around it. There was not much conscious manipulation. I think now when you look at reality shows, contestants go on those shows with agendas, and they've got like, I'm going to do this. I'm going to launch my spaghetti brand. I'm going to launch my shoe line. I'm going to be a radio star. This is what I want, something. And I think what made them, and perhaps not what made you guys so interesting as an ensemble, is that you didn't really quite know. And I suspect, I don't think anyone ever on the set of a television show, unless they're an astonishing wanker, sits around and says to everyone else, "Oh, we're changing the world here. We're changing television." No one says that. I think on most television sets that I've ever been on, the predominant unspoken feeling is that everyone is just grateful to be employed. And the secondary kind of energy, the principal creative energy, is they just want to do good work. And good work that satisfies them, and good work that nourishes whatever it is they're trying to do, or to tell the stories they want to tell. No one really sits there approaching the meta by going, "Oh, we're going to change TV." And I don't think the Big Brother cast, ironically, did either. I don't think they sat there going, "We're inventing this whole new genre, guys." They literally were sitting in a house, wandering around, probably really deeply unaware that after the first 24 hours, they did not understand that the 1 foot wide mirror strap built into every wall of the house was actually the front side of a camera run, behind which there were dozens of cameramen capturing everything, because they're oblivious to it. So that, and I'm not to say that you guys were oblivious to it, but to some extent you were. To some extent, I think you were all making a show, not overly conscious of the enduring cultural impact, because those are questions journalists ask, and they're questions that critics talk about. And indeed, they're things that producers like John Edwards might talk about in the post context. But, I've never met a producer who really talks about, the enduring legacy of a show while he's still making it. And so I think there's innocence in what you're doing as much as there is innocence in what the Big Brother cast were doing. Another ensemble of invented friendships in a different, they really are a fascinating cousin to what you're doing. Contextually, they're happening at the same time. The ensemble is not so different. It's just, again, a diverse hodgepodge of personalities and opinions and perspectives. They're operating a little differently, but I think what both groups share is a really profound sense, of how unaware they are of the impact that they're having, and the legacy that they will leave, and the tail, because the tail end, I think we still feel the tail end of The Secret Life of Us. The tail end of The Secret Life of Us was in Love My Way. It's in all the John Edwards shows. It's come up over the years, I feel like we still see it. Writers, it's informed writing, and it's not just done that. It's exported writing. Jacqueline Persky is obviously another John Edwards kind of writer-producer star who came out of these incubators. And she, like many of them, again, is international now. She, so what we see is that writer's room has a tail end that has not just shaped what we do here, but it's subtly and meaningfully shaping, in small ways, writers' rooms around the world. And television is a great example of that trajectory of small things become big things, small trends become big trends, and small ways of approaching the writing in a certain way, or the dialogue in a certain way, it feeds into something bigger. And I think it's part of, this is, one of many seeds that have led to much stronger, much more authentic, much more honest storytelling. And they've shaped our viewing habits. As viewers, they've adjusted our tolerances. They've let us be comfortable with things that maybe we weren't once upon a time. And we've navigated those sort of social, kind of grey zones to get our minds around the idea of not just seeing something that's actually wholly fictitious, but something that is a sort of a narrative fiction that's presented inside a kind of cultural truth.
Yeah, and I think you touch on that bit there about what we accept. I think for a while there would be cringe at putting just a normal style character. Someone goes, ugh, I don't want to see that. I want to see television. I want to see a fictitious world. We off air we mentioned Dallas. These kind of aspirational sort of places, etc. So to I guess see our tastes and flavors evolve into places where we love seeing that sort of stuff. And I know at the time, I think we'd had Queer as Folk came out just prior to us. Well, it was there. This Life, which I think was a big influencer, which is a bunch of young lawyers in London and the real life of share houses and that kind of stuff too, as well. And all of that led to what you say, this tolerance or appetite now to accept these sort of reflections of who we are in mainstream shows, which is just great.
It's also, I was going to say one quick thing, which is I think it's also, it's when I say there are many kind of starting points for this, Russell T Davies as a writer, for example, has a certain way to him. John Edwards and the writers that he brought forward, there's a certain way to them. The two groups don't come from the same place and they don't influence each other initially, I think, because they're on opposite sides of the world, but they are doing similar things at the same time. And I think that's where you get this notion of this is a show that is in isolation, just a show, but it is part of a kind of global groundswell of innovation in telling stories, innovation in dialogue. And there's clearly a kind of a style of producer coming in at this point saying, this is everything, this stuff is great, but it's just not, doesn't feel true. It doesn't feel strong. It doesn't feel interesting enough to me. It doesn't feel real. Like it just, and I think you kind of see this collective force. Because the other thing I think we do as artists is I always say to people, if you're feeling something, don't ever imagine you're feeling it in isolation. Because if you're reacting to the moment a certain way, chances are lots of people are too. And I think the collective moments are a real thing, and we are part of collective moments. And it's not that we copy each other or that we are close to each other or even have a sense of each other. Human beings do have a strange pack tendency. We do function a bit like a pack in places, and we do operate collectively without realizing it. It's fascinating to watch, but it's revealing about us. It reveals our most, structural animalistic functions, and it's fascinating to see it applied in how we make art and how we could go back 40,000 years and look at, cave paintings all over the world. They are different, but somehow they're also not different. Somehow they're the same. And you kind of go, these people didn't know each other. They're on opposite sides of the world. And yet somehow they came to these ideas in an evolutionary and cultural sense at the same time. And that's the gigantic prehistoric version of what we live, which is these ideas land because culturally we are a global village. Even if we're not connected all the time, we do collectively respond to ideas and emotions.
And interestingly, we went to air, 25 years ago, pre-social media, right? So, we're much more connected these days than we were. But as you say, we're on a journey to connect in deeper ways and continue to be. And I think, like you say, that the Russell T Davies and those writing rooms, that happening simultaneously, there's a bit of a global movement and appetite, through the collective conscious to kind of move towards these sorts of shows. And we were very lucky, I think, as well. We shot all of the first series before any of it went to air, so it was all in the can before it went out. So we didn't have to deal with that idea of dealing with the exposure and all that sort of stuff during season one. That joy awaited for us in season two. But I think it did protect the flavor and the integrity of that little world a bit for that little bit longer, which was just great. You talked about, as you say, no producer ever goes, I'm just busy making a culturally important, significant piece of television. I'll be right with you. No one does that. But we sit here 25 years on, and the show, I know 10 ran it back to back straight away, and normally they get the 3, and then within a year they'd gone through their 3 screenings. That happened there, because as an actor you kind of go to the 4th.
Yes, no, of course.
More.
I hope you got your check. Yes.
And since that time, it's been on Netflix, and there was a big resurgence. I'm going to say that's 2 or 3 years ago now that it hit there, but it's also been on 9, had it for a minute, on 9 now, 7 Plus still have it at the moment. ABC have just picked it up, and it's also on, if you have a Samsung, there's a thing on there called Samsung TV. It's running 24/7 on there, which I just find astonishing,
So, I mean, I guess there's 2 things I'd probably say. One of them is we do, I think, finally have a kind of an understanding of the snobbery of art, which is to say, I think lots of people who make film historically look down on TV. Lots of people who paint perhaps look down on film. I think we understand art in a way now that we didn't before, and I think we actually appreciate the art of television in ways that we should and are very meaningful. As a TV critic, I was always a great sort of supporter of the idea, championing the idea that TV is art, and it's as valuable to what we do as a Monet or a Michelangelo. And it might seem glib to say that, but what is television if not animated frescoes? That it's literally, this is what we watch. So I think the anniversary, the idea of the anniversary, is a great opportunity to reflect on the artistic magnificence of what took place in a way that we don't in the everyday, and certainly I don't think anybody did at the time. Although I think at the time, probably watching it, there were probably some thinkers at the time going, "Oh, this one's like one for the ages. There's something terribly interesting going on here." But I think also it's kind of striking to sort of assess what we see come from it, which is to say, Australian TV shows were quite, I think, famous for not pulling deeply from a pool of actors. And I think that means, what you do is there's a lot of reuse, which is not a bad thing. Obviously, it's good to keep actors in steady employment. I sometimes do look at a new show and think, could they have found somebody new? This is literally the cast of the last 4 shows are all in this show again.
Yes.
So I think one thing that John Edwards probably deserves huge credit for, and it doesn't happen often. Secret Life of Us is a good example of it. A lot of John Edwards shows are. Wentworth is a good example of it. I think Underbelly was a really good example of it. It's a show that comes along and goes, "Oh, wait, who are all these people? These people are all new. I don't know these people. I haven't seen these people." And this is a great show. And it's the proof is kind of in the pudding. You have all endured in various ways on stage, in film and television. It's one of those casts where you kind of go, "Oh, I think I sort of know where everybody is." Whereas sometimes you look at an old show and you go, "What have happened to these people? Where did these people end up?" And I think and Underbelly did the same thing. Wentworth did the same thing. Suddenly you were like, there's a real injection of new blood into the market. And this was a show that really was really, really bold in that way. I think artistically, it's really important to acknowledge this kind of greatness. And I think in a context where we tend to look around the world and we tend to elevate what's done around the world, we don't often put ourselves into that class. Like, you will see a critic do the 25 best shows of all time on TV. That list often doesn't go back before 1995, and that list obviously often doesn't get into Australia much. It tends to be, everyone tends to write. I've often said to other journalists working on those lists, look, here's the thing. If you're going to do that 25 or that 10 or that 15, do try to step outside Breaking Bad, The Wire, Sex and the City. I'm like, there's a list. The first 25 are automatic. So what you have to do is you either have to fall in line and just repeat them, or you have to be bold and sacrifice some of your children to make room for others.
Yes.
And I think this is a show that would rightly take a place on one of maybe the top 25 shows of all time, because I think the biggest question for those shows is not were they great, but did they leave a legacy? Did they actually have something to say that has a tail end that still sits with us? And I think The Secret Life of Us did.
Michael, I don't know if there's anything more to say. I think
of course, yeah.
I'm going to take all of that personally and all the
no. It's a remarkable show. I will tell you one other funny story, which I don't know how to frame, but it sits on that question, which is streaming is a transformational part of our interpretation of art, and by that I mean television. So if we look at television, there's three eras really. The first epoch of television is one in which we watched it and we never watched it again. And shows were overtaped, episodes are missing, there's chunks of early Doctor Who, chunks of early Number 96. Tape was expensive, so they literally would go, we don't know, no one's ever going to watch this again, and we'll overtape it. The second epoch of television is probably the one in which reruns became a thing. So suddenly channels will rerun shows. And by that I mean, obviously you guys make a show and 5 years later, 9 Now airs it, or whoever, someone else airs it, and there it is. We now live in the streaming era, which is just an on-demand, always available, nothing ever goes away, all work is immortal. And now that's challenging. I interview actors, directors, and writers every day of my life. And in different ways, many of them express the subtle anxiety around the idea that their earliest and worst work sits next to their most recent and best work and is assessed equally by the streaming audience. That's a big challenge. Because to be fair, sometimes putting Number 96 next to Game of Thrones, it's not gonna work. And you have to have an open heart. But one of the sweetest conversations I ever had was with Ron Howard, the director, who obviously is one of the most celebrated directors in film today, but who, by virtue of an extraordinary life, began his life as Richie Cunningham in the 60s sitcom Happy Days.
Mm-hmm. Know it well.
And we had a conversation around, I'd said to him, in the streaming era, this is a bit of a random question, but I don't imagine people come up to you and say, oh, I just saw Happy Days for the first time. But do you understand that out there, the audience, they're finding your work in the same breath that they're finding perhaps Richie Cunningham for the first time? And he said, not only is that true that it happened it happened yesterday, the day before. He said, I was stopped in the street by someone who had said, I just watched all of Happy Days on streaming. And it was amazing. And you're Richie Cunningham. And he was like, I am Richie Cunningham. And it's an extraordinary thing, because what it means is that gypsy quality to performance, which is to say that actors, I think, have always reveled in and hidden behind and danced around this idea that you take up the work, but you discard the work, and that you are the character, and then you're not the character anymore. I had the same conversation recently with Robin Wright, who was doing a show for Amazon called The Girlfriend. And we were at a TV festival and we sat down for an interview. And at various points of that interview, I was like, because she knows me, she knows I'm a fan of Santa Barbara, which is the soap opera that she started her career in, because we'd many years ago done a bunch of interviews at various times, and the PR rep was always, you can't ask about anything but this project. And in the end, several interviews later, she was the one who said, I think he's going to ask about Santa Barbara, but that's okay because I'm ready for it. But I was like, Forrest Gump, The Princess Bride, Santa Barbara, here are these pieces of work that have found their immortality. And she was like, I'm very accepting now. I completely understand that I will be stopped in the street for the rest of my life by somebody who just wants to share a moment about The Princess Bride. And she was like, and you know what? I'm okay with that. And I think that's the other great change about how we relate to a show like this, which is to say, you are still in your first season. For a piece of the audience out there watching the first season for the first time, The Secret Life of Us is a piece of new content. So, and the lesson perhaps for producers and writers is not to think about the legacy of your show, but probably to understand in the here and now that your first season, your every episode will be a first run for someone for the rest of all of our lives, for the rest of eternity, for the rest of civilization, so long as civilization retains the technology to record and replay these images. That's the change. And I think that affects not you, that affects everybody in this era. It affects you perhaps less than it might affect a show from an era where the production values were poorer or the writing was worse. But I think the stunning thing about it is that in 2025, out there right now, someone will press play on episode 1, and for them, this will be a meaningful trajectory, but seen in a 2025 context. And to be fair, whether they knew it at the time or not, I suspect they didn't, because I don't really think anyone does. But the writers of The Secret Life of Us, when you put down on paper a story around a trajectory like Richie's, which is he is a closeted actor struggling with his sexuality and dealing with that juxtaposition of potential fame and terrible exposure, we still watch that in 2025. If you go to TMZ or you pick up a tabloid in America, those are still stories. Matt Bomer can tell you that story. Neil Patrick Harris can tell you that story. All of these great actors can tell you that story, and they're telling you that story from their lived experience in the here and now. Even though all those years ago, Richie's story was put down to paper, there weren't a lot of Richies, not tangible examples in the media. He was written maybe with a knowing sense of understanding from a writer's room who knew people like Richie, but his truth is great truth, and it endures in 2025. And in 2025, out there, someone is pressing play on episode 1, watching these trajectories and seeing what we perhaps could never see at the time, which is their eternal relevance, which is, I mean, the cute punchline to that is, I have begged the working dog people many, many, many times. Michael Hirsch will attest to this. Rob Sitch will attest to this. I think there's another 50 seasons in Frontline because the state of journalism and television current affairs, all journalism, all current affairs in 2025 is so complex and in such a risky, strange space that Frontline has extraordinary observations to make about that it was making all those years ago, that, you could rewatch Frontline and in the here and now, you will get 10 times out of it what we got back then, because the world is more complex, and this show, this piece of art, is talking to that complexity in an extraordinary way. The Secret Life of Us is great. I think power that endures is that, which is to say that in 2025, it is challenging and fascinating in ways that we can only interpret in the here and now, if we've never seen it before. Very different, perhaps, to what people experienced in the first run. And that is great art. Great art is a painting like the Mona Lisa, which is ever-changing and completely frozen in time. The Mona Lisa doesn't change. That's all it is. Yet, if you stand in every part of that room, someone will tell you they see something different. If you look at the still image online, every interpretation of it is unique. And in that moment, and that's where I think in 2025, that's where you live. You live with a show that is 25 years old, and for someone out there is 25 seconds old. And they are different shows, and they are the same show.
Michael, thank you so much for spending some time with me today. It's lovely.
Joyful.
And and hear your thoughts on The Secret Life of Us.
Pleasure.
That's it for this episode of McLaren Versus. I'm Spencer McLaren, and thank you for spending some time with us. If you enjoyed this chat, then please don't forget to follow and leave us a review.